Okay, so as many of you may have already heard, the American Cancer Society fundraiser Relay for Life is this Friday night at Gordon Track. The event increases awareness and raises money for cancer education, research, and treatment. It's not too late to get involved either by registering online, donating to a participant, or showing up at the event to see what it's all about. At the event, we will have Root Beer Beirut, a cappella and band performances, a Miss Relay pageant, and movies and games, and all the while people will be walking laps around the track to remember those lost, celebrate survivors, and hope for a future cure. Look out for emails and check out our Facebook group for more information. I hope to see you all there. Thanks.
Hi, good morning. We're going to pick up where we left off last time, but before we do, a few of you came to me after class and asked about alternative forms of exercise. So the study that I gave, also what you read, the article by Callahan and others, is mostly about aerobic exercise. And as I mentioned earlier, this is about moderate intensity workout, which would mean, if you want to work with pulse, about 70%, between 65 and 75% of your maximum heart rate. Again, you just Google heart rate exercise and you'll immediately get all the tables that you need. But that's one form of exercise. Some of you ask, what about weight training? What about interval training? So sprints and stops, something that the crew team does often, athletes do often. What about this form? The reason why I didn't bring it up explicitly in the lecture is because the jury's still out on the different forms of exercise. But let me tell you what are some of the trends that we see in research. Right now, it seems that if there is only one form of exercise that you do, the best bang for the buck, best value for your time would be aerobic exercise. 3, ideally 4 times 30 minutes of aerobic exercise a week. That's at minimum. However, if you can also do weight training and supplement the aerobic exercise, that's terrific, that's great. Twice a week, 3 times a week of weight training is great, especially as you get older. That weight training contributes more. But also at a very young age, weight training is good. However, it is not a replacement for aerobic exercise. It hasn't shown to have the same psychological effects as aerobic exercise does. The other form of exercise that has been studied, and again, these are all tentative results. There have been pilot studies about it. The ends, the sample sizes are not large enough yet to say definitively, just like we can say about aerobic exercise, it has a similar effect to some of our most powerful psychiatric drugs. That's definitive. There are tons of studies on it ever since Babiak 2000 as well as before. But another form of exercise that has begun to be studied with some very promising results is interval training. Interval training would be, say, running at between 90 and 95% of your maximum heart rate. So if you're 20 and your maximum heart rate would be 200, because it's 220 minus your age, then it would be running at around 180 to 190 pulse rate, which is hard, which is tough, which you can't do for a very long time. But doing it for as little as 30 seconds up to a minute, and then resting, letting your heart rate go back down to 60% of its maximum, say 120, and then doing another interval, that has been shown with pilot studies only to have remarkable effects. In fact, often more powerful than aerobic exercise on its own, and lasts for even longer, the effect. So, again, I did not introduce it officially as part of the class, but since many of you asked, I'm introducing it because what I want to introduce here are only things that are with very robust results. John Ratey talks about this, and I'll talk a little bit about John Ratey in a minute. He's the Harvard Medical School psychiatrist who's probably the leading proponent and researcher in the area of exercise and mental health. And he himself, even though the results are still tentative, he introduces 2 interval trainings a week. So in addition to working out 6 days a week, 2 of them include full-out sprinting, rest, full-out sprinting, rest. And what they've shown is that with even less time than 30 minutes, you can get the same psychological effect and even better. What I do twice a week, I introduce interval training. So for example, this morning when I was on my trampoline, I did it for 30 minutes, and out of the 30 minutes, there were 4 sprints. Indeed. You don't believe me that I do trampoline, do you? I'll videotape it. Maybe not. So 4 sessions of sprints, and then I have my heart monitor on, going all the way, for me, it's about 165 heart rate, between 165 and 170. And then resting, going back to about 110, which is more or less 60% of my maximum, and then doing it 4 times. And for the rest of the 30 minutes, I just do moderate aerobic exercise. So I also introduce the interval training. The weight training I do less of because I get that from yoga, a lot of the strengthening exercises. The most important thing, though, that I do want to say about interval training is that, especially for perfectionists, it's very easy to overtrain. You don't want to get to your maximum heart rate and keep it there for a long time, even if you can. More does not necessarily mean better. Again, unless you're training for the Olympics, in which case you do want to get to 100% of your maximum heart rate at times. For maximum health, you want to get to 90%, maximum 95% of your max heart rate, which is why a heart rate monitor can help so much, because it can tell you when you're working too hard or when it's too easy. Bottom line, variety is good for exercise. If you can introduce dancing, that's great exercise. If you can introduce once in a while working out in the gym, once in a while playing basketball, rowing, the more variety, the better. But the foundation, at least 3, ideally 4 times a week, 30 minutes of aerobic exercise. So we stopped last time with overcoming barriers. And some of the barriers are that it's difficult, there is some pain associated with it, even if you are at 70% of your heart rate. It's still uncomfortable. And ways to deal with it is, at least until you get into it, because very often we enter the zone when we start to run and we don't feel the difficulty anymore. But at least at the beginning, it's important to have social support, to divide and conquer, to build gradually, and to have distractors such as TV, your MP3 or whatever it is. Another barrier, and this one is unfortunately very common here on campus, is that we just don't have time. In high school, I give a lot of talks in high schools, and one of the things that I see there is that students generally, in many high schools, actually have to be part of a team. They have to, in addition to doing physical exercise, PE, they also have to be part of a team. So they get not enough, but more exercise. Whereas one of the first things that go in college, especially or only for students who do not play on the team, one of the first things that go is exercise. I don't have time. I have so many things I want to do. It's a new world. Well, it's also the first thing that goes during exam period because I'm so stressed and I have so many things to do. Well, it should be the last thing to go. It should be the last thing to go. Why? Because it is an investment. You may be losing the 45 minutes, working out for 30 minutes and showering after, which I recommend. You may lose that 45 minutes, but you'll gain so much more. It's such a good investment. Why? Because your memory actually gets better when you exercise. So you get more bang for the buck in terms of time you study. Your creativity levels go up. Your concentration, whether you have ADD or not, especially if you have a tendency toward ADD or ADHD. But even for people without it, concentration goes up significantly. Energy levels go up significantly. So it's a very good investment. Remember I told you the story when I stopped exercising at the end of the squash season. And suddenly I said, I have so much time. And I ended up getting so much less done. A, because I didn't have the rituals, and B, because I wasn't as focused, I wasn't as creative, I wasn't as energized. It should be the last thing to go, especially during stressful periods such as exam period. One way to overcome the time commitment, again, is not to rely on self-discipline. We've established that before we saw the research. We have a limited amount of self-discipline. Create rituals where, say, 3 mornings during the week you'll do it, or if a good time for you is the afternoon or evening, but have a ritual around it. Another barrier to exercising regularly, and this is an interesting one and often overlooked but extremely powerful, and that is the subconscious barrier. Nathaniel Branden talks about this, and I talk about it a little bit in my book, quoting him. He talks about self-esteem, and part of self-esteem is the notion that we are worthy of happiness, the notion of being worthy of happiness. And when you ask people, are you worthy of happiness, most people will say yes. But if you ask the subconscious, very often for many people, it's no. Whether it's because of the voices that we heard in the past, from teachers, educators, parents, significant adults, society at large, by comparing us to unrealistic models. But very often we have this voice, the subconscious level, that we're not really worthy of happiness. And that is a barrier that stops us from becoming happier. Now, one of the things that we know with exercise is that it's one of the, if not the most powerful drug for making us happier. Now, I know that exercise makes me happier, it makes me feel good, but if my subconscious thinks that I'm unworthy of these feelings, unworthy of being happy, it may, in fact, stop me from exercising. Why? Because remember, the mind doesn't like when there is an inconsistency between what's inside and what's outside. And if what's inside is saying, shouldn't be happy, then I try to match it with what's inside. And then I don't exercise. Because if I do exercise, then there will be a disconnect. I will be happier than I think I'm worthy of. There's a lot of research on this. For example, by a psychologist by the name of Swan, who talks about self-confirmation theory, which is a very powerful force within us. There is a self-enhancement that we want to appear good in other people's eyes, in our eyes, but there is a counter force, which is self-confirmation, where we want to confirm whatever we think about ourselves. And if we think not worthy of happiness, we'll very often not do things that actually will make us happy. We see it in other areas, in relationships, for example. If I think I'm unworthy of a wonderful partner, of being happy in a relationship, very often I will inadvertently, working here, jeopardize the relationship and look for things that are not working. Actively, subconsciously, look for ways of hurting the relationship. So we need to be aware of the subconscious level, and it very much applies to whether or not we exercise. So what do we do with this? The best thing to do is to just do it. Again, ritualize it, not analyze it too much. Just go ahead and exercise. 3-4 times a week is good for you, just do it. And again, it's the 5-minute takeoff. The subconscious mind will try and tell you, don't do it, you don't have time, there are other things, you'll do it tomorrow. Next week you'll start the regime. The subconscious mind is very smart in its attempt and will do anything that it can almost to create this congruency. And when you go out and exercise and you show yourself, yes, I am worthy of happiness, very often the subconscious mind will follow suit. So just do it. The second thing is recognize, this is on the cognitive level, recognize how important physical exercise is. Remember what Marty Seligman said. We mostly focus on neck up, and we do it as psychologists, we do it as students in an academic institution, especially in a place like this. So much is about thinking and cognition. That's how you got here. That's how you were successful. But it's no less important to think about neck down. In fact, the mind alone can only take us so far when it comes to happiness. Which is why I told you, if I were a therapist, a prerequisite for me to treat people would be to have them exercise regularly, because I don't want to fight nature. I want to work with nature and build on it. Exercise, in many ways, is the unsung hero of psychological interventions. It helps on so many levels. John Ratey, mentioned him, Harvard Medical School professor, psychiatrist. In a way, exercise can be thought of as psychiatrist's dream treatment. It works on anxiety, on panic disorder, and on stress in general, which has a lot to do with depression. And it generates the release of neurotransmitters, norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine, that are very similar to our most important psychiatric medicines. Having a bout of exercise is like taking a little bit of Prozac and a little bit of Ritalin right where it is supposed to go. The exact right amount of it, the exact right location, and without side effects, or with side effects, positive side effects, physical as well as mental and emotional side effects. What John Ratey is calling for in his wonderful, wonderful book, just came out recently in this January, what he calls for is an exercise revolution. And he backs up this call with a lot of scientific evidence of why it is so important. Let me share with you just one area that he talks about. He talks about all ages. He talks about kids, adults, as well as the elderly population. And it has positive effects for every age, from 0 to 120. Let me talk about a couple of studies and findings that were implemented, where exercise was implemented in schools. So there are a few schools that introduced physical exercise as an integral part of its curriculum. For example, and this has been replicated in a few schools, every morning 45 minutes of some form of exercise. Usually running, sometimes rowing, cycling, climbing. There's a school that in New Jersey that actually put a climbing wall where students exercised. But some form of aerobic exercise, sometimes intertwined with interval training, every morning before school, 45 minutes a day. Some of the schools had it later during the day, most of them in the morning. Here are some of the results from some of these schools that actually introduced it. Obesity levels, not surprising, went down. For example, in Naperville in Illinois, in the district there where physical exercise was introduced in school, which is, by the way, interesting, because in most schools, just yesterday I gave a talk at Horace Mann, and the teachers told me that in many of the schools in New York, physical exercise is being taken out rather than more of it is introduced. Physical exercise and art, both taken out. Why? Because they have to get the grades. Neck up. And that's a pity, and they pay a price. So obesity in the school in Naperville, or in the district Naperville in Illinois, obesity levels went down from 30% to 3% among the students. That has repercussions not just for the students' lives there, that they're more comfortable, that they're happier. It has repercussions and consequences for the rest of their lives. They're much less susceptible and prone to the chronic illnesses, such as cancer, heart failure. It's a win-win on so many levels, much less susceptible to diabetics. So that's obesity. What they also find at Naperville is that the grades went up significantly. In fact, usually the U.S. doesn't do very well when it comes to those international tests, math and science tests that they do. I think it's usually in 8th grade. Well, Naperville is an exception. They scored number 6 in the world in mathematics and number 1 in the world in science. Now, people argue, well, Naperville is an affluent neighborhood or district, and it's true. How about other places? Well, they introduced exercise in very poor areas, in inner cities. For example, in Titusville, Pennsylvania, where many people are way below, where the average is way below the average income for the state. When before they introduced exercise, school performance, they were significantly below state average, Pennsylvania's average. After introducing exercise, within a year, they went up to 17% above state average, with the only change being that year introducing physical exercise. They've seen this in other schools, in other districts as well. And what they also saw in the same school, in Titusville, that fist fights, for example, they noticed violence disappeared completely as a result of the exercise. What they found also in a school in Iowa, where they introduced physical exercise, disciplinary problems went down from 225 to 95 in 1 year. In another school in Kansas, also inner city, disciplinary problems went down by 67% after they introduced exercise. We're much less likely to be violent. It calms us. It brings us to our natural state of being, which is much calmer as opposed to being angry and upset. And people need to let out that steam. And unfortunately, very often that steam is let out in fights with aggression. And this is a much healthier way to divert that healthy energy. Let me show you a clip from one of my favorite movies, Legally Blonde. And it's the part where a woman is just being charged with the murder of her husband. And our very own law school graduate, Reese Witherspoon, defends her. Whoops. Let me get to it. Thank you. Videos. Legally, here it is.
We're defending Brooke Wyndham, whose very wealthy husband was found shot to death in their Beacon Hill mansion.
Gold digger?
You'd think so, since the stiff was 60, but she was rich on her own, some kind of fitness empire. You can buy her exercise tapes on infomercials.
Wait, are you talking about Brooke Taylor?
Maiden name Taylor. You know her?
She's at Delta Nu. She wasn't in my pledge class, but she graduated 4 years before me. But I used to take her class at the Los Angeles Sports Club. She's amazing.
Amazing? How?
She can make you lose like 3 pounds in one class. She's completely gifted.
Well, in all likelihood, she's completely guilty as well.
I just don't think Brooke could have done this. Exercise gives you endorphins. Endorphins make you happy. Happy people just don't shoot their husbands. They just don't.
There you go. Sorry. You know, in the book, I talk about the happiness revolution. And I think, based on a lot of research, that the foundation for a happiness revolution has to come with an exercise revolution. Why? Because if we don't exercise, we're fighting against nature. So the foundation, the basis of a happiness revolution has to start neck down through the body. Let me move on to a second mind-body intervention, and that is meditation. So, what is meditation? I was first introduced to it through yoga. I got injured playing squash. My back, they told me yoga would help. I started yoga, it helped my back, and I got so much more out of it. In fact, so much more out of it that I'm doing my teacher training now with Debbie Cohen, and will become a yoga instructor hopefully very soon if she passes me. There are other forms of mindfulness meditation, sitting meditation. There is Tai Chi, Qi Kong. There is meditation that just focuses on the breath. There is meditation that focuses on compassion. There are a few common elements to most types of meditation. Let me mention a few of them. First of all, it's focusing on one thing. Whether it's the movement, whether it's the posture, whether it's the breath, whether it's compassion and loving kindness, whether it's a flame, whatever it is, but it's focusing, whether it's a prayer, it's focusing on one thing. Usually, most forms of meditation, the foundation is deep breathing. In a sense, the way a baby breathes. Belly breathing. Breathing all the way into your belly, and then slowly, gently, gracefully breathing out. Deep breathing is usually the foundation, whether it's of Tai Chi, yoga, or sitting meditation. And finally, there is no good or bad meditation. Meditation, in a sense, doesn't have a purpose when you're meditating. You're giving yourself the permission to be human. There is no, I just had an amazing meditation, or I just feel enlightened. In fact, let me tell you a story about how I became enlightened through meditation. So, last year, I used to travel quite a bit. We lived in Israel, but I traveled once a month on average to the U.S. for a few days. And when I traveled here, I used to give talks, but I also used that time as a form of retreat. And what I would do is I would practice a lot of yoga, much more than I did in Israel. I did a lot of meditation. I had a lot of time between talks. So I had plenty of time, and I used it as a retreat. And I remember one time coming home, back to Israel, and just to give you the context, in Israel we live in a city just outside Tel Aviv called Ramat Gan, and our house is in a 20-story building. We live on the 10th floor, and the view is just breathtaking. Israel is a very tiny country, so I can see both sides of Israel. The Mediterranean on one side, I can see the mountains of Samaria on the other side. Just gorgeous view. And one of the things that I like to do is every morning, because I'm a morning person, I wake up usually before the rest of the family. I sit down in the dining room and look outside through the glass window. And we have a glass window. Since it's so high, it's fortified glass, of course, and part of it does not open. But I look through that part that does not open outside, and I do it very often. And I remember coming back from this particular trip and from the U.S. and looking outside, and suddenly all the colors seemed so much brighter. The world seemed so much clearer. And I said to myself, wow, I must have become enlightened. Because I've read in books and I've heard people talking about it that when you become enlightened, everything becomes clear. The world becomes even more beautiful than it already is. And I was sitting there on the sofa and just admiring the strong colors, the beauty, the clarity of everything. And I said to myself, after so many years, I've been meditating for over 10 years, after so many years, I'm finally enlightened. And I started to act differently because, enlightened people don't go around telling people that they're enlightened. Well, this is an exception, but... So I didn't tell anyone, I didn't even tell Tommy that I'm enlightened, but I was walking on air. And the next day, the next morning, I would wake up and again my ritual observation of the mountains in the distance, and I said, wow, the world is so beautiful. I'm enlightened. And that went on for a few days, and then one day, Tommy and I were sitting together in the lounge, and just chatting, and she was looking outside, and I was looking outside, and she said, finally when you went away, after so long, I finally was able to clean the window. I said, what? And she said, I haven't been able to get out there, but I got this machine, the two-sided machine with a magnet. I was finally able to get it, and I finally cleaned the window. So much for my enlightenment. So, maybe there is enlightenment. I don't know. But the key with meditation is not about reaching that stage when everything suddenly becomes so clear. I think a quicker path would be to clean the window. But that's not what meditation is about. Meditation is about being present, being in the here and now, struggling with being in the here and now. And when we lose our thought, when we lose our focus on the breath, simply bringing it back. That is the practice. Losing it and bringing it back, losing it and bringing it back. And that's how we exercise our mind to be more focused, to be more mindful. So let me share with you some of the studies on meditation. And once you start meditation or yoga, and by the way, you will find what is right for you. Being ADHD, it was very difficult for me to do sitting meditation. Much more conducive for me to do yoga. Because I'm working hard, it keeps my mind focused on the posture. For other people, the right thing is sitting meditation, just breathing. For others, it's thinking about certain things. For many people, it's praying. Whatever works for you. And it can be, of course, a few things. You can pray and do yoga. So let me share with you some of the studies. The real serious studies on meditation started by looking at the tip of the stem, at the meditators, people who've been doing it for many years, for a very long time. And what they asked, the researchers like Richie Davidson, University of Wisconsin, John Kabat-Zinn from University of Amherst, Worcester, people like Herbert Benson, Paul Ekman from one of the UCs, and other people, when they wanted to study meditation, they said, let's study the best. So they contacted the Dalai Lama himself and said, can you suggest some people who have been meditating for a very long time, serious meditators, and we want to study their brain. So they did. And they brought them in, and what they looked for, the first thing, remember, left to right prefrontal cortex ratio. And if you remember, we talked about it, people who are happier generally have more activation on the left side of the prefrontal cortex. People who are less happy have more activation on the right side of the prefrontal cortex. So that ratio is important. And it's one of the quote-unquote objective means of measuring happiness. One of the things that they have found is that there is very high correlation between what our brain looks like under the scanner and our self-report about how happy we are. Not 100% correlation, not a 1, but pretty high, suggesting that self-report are pretty are quite reliable. But anyway, so they wanted to look at the brain of the meditators. And when they looked at the general public, we all exist on a bell curve. The happier people are further on, more activation on the left side. The less happy people are further, more activation, higher ratio on the right side. And then they brought in the meditators. And they measured their left to right prefrontal cortex. And here is what they found. This is the normal bell curve. This is where the meditators were. This is from 2001. Since, they have found numerous meditators that are quite literally off the chart, suggesting very high levels of well-being and happiness, being susceptible to positive emotions and resilient in the face of painful emotions. So this is a remarkable result. Again, results that they had not seen before until they measured these meditators. The other things that they were interested in looking at, the other important indicator for well-being and calmness, is the startle response. And when you hear a bang, you startle. And the startle response is important because the easier you get startled, generally it's correlated with higher levels of anxiety, susceptibility at least to anxiety. And everyone has the startle response to some degree. Even marksmen and women in the military, who shoot their guns every day and they try and remain completely focused. Even they startle, when the gun goes off. They flinch very slightly, but they do. So it's impossible to suppress the startle response. Or so they thought. When Paul Ekman brought these meditators in and asked them to maintain complete equanimity and calmness, and he startled them, there was no reaction whatsoever. First time in recorded history that people have been able to suppress the startle response. Here was what Daniel Goleman writes about this in his book, Destructive Emotions. Given that the larger someone's startled, the more intensely that person tends to experience upsetting emotions, Osser's performance had tantalizing implications, suggesting a remarkable level of emotional equanimity. That equanimity was also contagious, so people who tried to argue with these monks very often had a hard time becoming angry or upset, even if the topic was personally upsetting to them, such as scientists arguing about the existence of God. And they said, I couldn't get upset because calm is contagious, just like happiness is. Now, some of you may not be 100% clear about what the startle response is. So for those of you who are not, I've prepared a very brief clip.
I get no kick from champagne. Pure alcohol doesn't thrill me at all. So tell me, why should it be true that I get a kick? Some gal in the sky, my idea of nothing to do. That I get a kiss, you give me a boot. I get a kick out of you.
Sure, the mask doesn't do anything to him, but you want to see something really scary? It's Dad!
Okay. All right. Now you understand. When they studied these meditators, essentially what they were doing was applying what we've talked about, the growing tip statistic. What Maslow talks about is the growing tip statistic, studying the best. Because if you want to advance knowledge, if you want to be able to better apply ideas that work, you don't study the average teacher, you study Marva Collins. You don't study the average meditator who thinks he's enlightened, you study the meditators who have been doing it for many years. Lama Osser, one of these meditators. The process itself has some extraordinary qualities, but not necessarily the subject. The important idea is that the process is within the reach of anyone who applies himself or herself with enough determination. In other words, this is not just for these select few who can meditate for 30 years, 8 hours a day. It can be applied because the process is relatively simple to all of us. Daniel Goleman. From the perspective of neuroscience, the point of all this research has nothing to do with demonstrating that Osser or any other extraordinary person may be remarkable in him or herself, but rather to stretch the field's assumptions about human possibility, about our potential. Some of these key assumptions have already begun to expand, in part due to a revolution in neuroscience's supposition about the malleability of the brain itself. Remember neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, these concepts how scientists like Richie Davidson identified that our brain is malleable, it can change, and one of the ways to change it is through meditation. Now, this is all well and good, so we can apply this process with determination to our lives, but how many people here seriously would say, okay, that sounds great, I want my left side of the prefrontal cortex to be more active, so I'm going to go off to the Himalayas and meditate for 30 years, 8 hours a day. I mean, how many people are really prepared to do this? How many people have time for 2 hours a day of meditation? The second problem with this research is that it's correlational. There's no causation here. Maybe Lama Osir was born that way, and that's why he was attracted to meditation. Maybe Matthias Ricard has written a book on happiness, Dalai Lama's translator, right-hand man. Maybe he was born that way with a remarkable left-to-right prefrontal cortex. His, by the way, was literally off the charts. But the main problem still remains, beyond causation, is the time. Do we have the time? Do we have the patience to meditate so often and so much? Now, when I started to meditate, to do yoga, I really saw the benefits of it. And I said, okay, so I'm getting benefits when I'm doing it for half an hour a day. What if I do a real long retreat? And they have some great 10-day long retreats. And I said to Tommy, I want to go to a 10-day retreat. And Tommy knows me pretty well. And she said, why don't you try, it's not all or nothing. Why don't you try a one-day retreat first before you go on the 10-day retreat? And I said, that's a good idea. And I went to a one-day retreat, which is not very far from here in Cambridge. And I went to this retreat, and I was very excited. It was on a Saturday, and I was looking forward to it all week. And I said, I'm starting the process of enlightenment, of course, through this one-day retreat. And right after that one-day retreat, once I proved to Tommy that it's good for me and she'll see how calm I am after, she'll say, sure, we'll go for the 10-day retreat. So I went to that one-day retreat. And the one-day retreat, we came in, and there was a gentleman who was sitting in front of the class with a beard, looking very calm, and I said, I'm going to look like him at the end of the day, and minus the beard. And we sat down, and he said, we're going to start with sitting meditation. So we all sat, we had our cushions. I need a few cushions, there. We were sitting there. I put my hands here, and he said, okay, now breathe deeply through your nostrils, and then breathe out again. And we did that, and I was sitting there, and my mind, being ADHD, started to wander, but he said, if the mind wanders, bring it back to the focus. And we were sitting there, and for what seemed like a very long time, and I stayed there, and I said, okay, your mind wanders, it's okay, come back to it. And I continued to sit there, and we sat for 45 minutes. And at the end, he said, okay, gently, slowly open your eyes and stand up. And he said, what we're going to do now, the second part, after the 45-minute first part of sitting meditation, we're going to do some walking meditation. And he illustrated. And then we walked behind him around in a circle. And we walked very slowly, very diligently, just focusing on each step, lifting up the leg. And he said, just focus on the movement, be present in the here and now. And if your mind wanders, which mine did constantly, bring it back to the walking. And continue to breathe deeply, just like you did during the sitting meditation. So we were walking around the room for a very long time. And we walked, and we continued to walk around that room, and my mind continued to wander. And I got bored. So what I did was I started to look around at the other people, and they were all walking in the circle. And then I looked to where the teacher was sitting. And next to the teacher, there was a piece of paper. And I thought, oh, interesting. I wonder what it says there. So I continued to walk. And then I got to the piece of paper again and I said, oh, it's a schedule, how interesting. And I didn't have enough time to actually read what it said there, so I said, next time around I have something to look forward to. So I continued to walk, and I see, this is what we did, 45 minutes of sitting meditation, and after that 45 minutes of walking meditation. I wonder what's next. And I continued to walk, and now I had something to look forward to. I was excited. And I looked just below, and 45 minutes of sitting meditation, and then 45 minutes of walking meditation. Whoa! And another set of sitting and walking. Oh, and then lunch. I wonder what we do after lunch. 45 minutes of sitting meditation and walking. Whoa. And after that, walking meditation. So I thought to myself, wow, this is incredible. I'll see you next time. Jeez. And I walked out. I couldn't take it. So, and I ran home, but I must say I was a little bit embarrassed. So I thought, wait, maybe I'll spend the day outside, and just come back home and seem enlightened at least. But I didn't, so I called Tammy and I told her, do you want to have breakfast together? And we did. She gives me the permission to be human. I don't see myself going on a 10-day retreat. I don't see myself going on a 30-year retreat. And my question was then, as it is now, how can meditation help people who don't want to or simply can't meditate for such a long time? And don't get me wrong, I do recommend these retreats. There are people who go to these retreats and come out looking differently. I know many of my friends have been there. But that's, again, a 1-day retreat or a 10-day retreat. Some people have gone to as long as 3 months retreat, and they are good. Just not for me. So what can we do? John Kabat-Zinn in his research showed how meditation can apply to the people who don't want to do full days, who just have 45 minutes a day or as little as 15 minutes a day for meditation or yoga or some form of mindfulness. And he did two things. First of all, he showed how it helps for people who do less than the 30 years. And second, equally important, he showed causation. So he took two groups in one of his studies, two groups. The one group, both groups wanted to do meditation, so they expressed an interest. One group he put on a waiting list, and he said, you'll participate in the seminar in about 3 months. Or it was 4 months. In 4 months, you'll participate in the seminar. We're all booked out. The second group started the meditation regime workshop then. And the regime was essentially 45 minutes of meditation a day. During the weekend they were together where they learned some techniques, but during the week when they were at home, 45 minutes a day of meditation. And then he compared them to the control group, the group that was waiting for a retreat, waiting for the lessons, because he wanted them to be of the same kind, people who want to do meditation. One that actually started, one that is going to start soon. And then he measured anxiety and compared to the control group anxiety levels of those who did meditation for 8 weeks. Just 8 weeks, 45 minutes a day on average. Anxiety decreased significantly. Then he looked at their happiness level, at the positive, not just the negative to the zero to the positive. And they were happier, they had better moods after as little as 8 weeks. But here are the clinchers. He then said, well, it's not enough to just self-report. It could be placebo, which is great, but he wanted to see is there something else beyond just the placebo. And here is what he found. He looked at their left to right prefrontal cortex. And after as little as 8 weeks, there was a significant difference in those individuals who meditated. Now, this is a remarkable result. Remember, until 1998, scientists were sure that the brain is not malleable, does not change past the age of 3 or so. And suddenly here, within as little as 8 weeks, these meditators, or individuals, regular people doing 45 minutes of meditation a day, are changing the way their brain functions, making them more susceptible to positive emotions, more resilient in the face of painful emotions. Herbert Benson from our medical school here has shown that with as little as 15 to 20 minutes a day of meditation, you see a significant change over time in levels of well-being. Emotional well-being as well as physical well-being, because the other study that John Kabat-Zinn did with these meditators was inject both groups, the control group who were waiting and the meditators. He injected them with cold bacteria. And what he wanted to do, what he wanted to measure was how would their body react in terms of antibodies. And what he found was that the meditators' immune response was significantly stronger than those who didn't meditate, who were waiting to meditate. Just based on 8 weeks of meditation, 45 minutes a day. And we know that, when we're calmer, we're less susceptible to illnesses. When we're stressed, we're more susceptible to illnesses. So meditation strengthens both the psychological immune system in making us more resilient, as well as the physical immune system. Mindfulness has been used in numerous areas, numerous places, as therapy, more and more so today, both as in together with cognitive behavioral therapy, together with medicine, medication, as well as on its own. And it's been shown to be extremely effective. The book I recommend, if you want to get a good outline of what the field has to say, is called The Mindful Way Through Depression, that talks about how mindfulness can help us overcome major depression, mild depression, as well as things like anxiety, and how it can also help other psychological disorders. And one of the things, for example, that they show there, unfortunately we know that once someone has major depression, the likelihood of it reappearing, whether it's a month later or sometimes years later, is much higher than if we've never had major depression. Why? Think about what we have discussed before. What we talked about is how the brain creates neural pathways. Now, if a neural pathway has been created and it's a strong neural pathway of depression, very often something which is relatively mild that happens can send us back to that neural pathway. So we go through a relatively hard period, nothing that serious, but immediately the brain looks for the largest neural pathway, the largest river, metaphorically speaking, and it goes there. And we have the major depression again, with little reason. And after we have it 2 or 3 times, the neural pathways are even stronger, even more likely to recur. What they have found when they introduced mindfulness meditation or mindfulness therapy, in addition to cognitive behavioral therapy, was that it reduced the likelihood of recurrence of major depression among people who have major depression or had major depression, reduces the likelihood by over 50% of relapse. That's in a longitudinal study. So this really helps. It also helps deal with non-major depression. It helps dealing with sadness. Now, how does it work? How does it work? Let me, again, very briefly, I do recommend this book. We could have a whole course on this book. The book has also got an 8-week program, which is fantastic. Its first level, it's about awareness and acceptance of the body signal. What do they mean here? You see, whenever we experience an emotion, there is always a physical manifestation to it. Positive emotions such as happiness, it could be butterflies or just feeling very broad in the upper body or whatever it is, but also painful emotions. For example, when I experience anxiety, it's here. I feel it here. Or here, the knot in my stomach that I talked about. People who experience depression or even sadness feel it somewhere. Again, whether it's in the stomach, whether it's in the shoulders, there's always a physical manifestation to an emotional experience. And what they are saying, and what the research has shown, is that when we begin to experience a painful emotion, immediately going and becoming mindful, aware of whatever the physical manifestation is. So instead of beginning to ruminate and to dwell on why am I depressed, what's going on, what's happening, not again, I hope this won't start. Instead of going into this rumination, going immediately to the physical manifestation of it, to the body. So okay, I'm beginning to feel stress, okay, and focusing on it and accepting that not trying to fix it, as we'll talk about in a minute. Simply accepting it for what it is. Looking at it and say, oh, that's interesting. Oh, it's quite a big knot. Oh, no, it's small. Oh, it's getting actually bigger. As opposed to saying, I want it to go away. Oh, it is going away. That's interesting. But that's not the purpose. The purpose is simply to become aware of it. Simply to become aware of whatever the physical manifestation of the emotion is. Now, why does this work? It works because it creates an alternative neural pathway, where the usual neural pathway that is created when we feel dis-ease is going into the mind, ruminating about it, and usually going to the channel that existed before. The channels or channels that existed before, and these are channels associated with our depression or our previous negative experiences that have been reinforced. What we're doing now, instead of going into these reinforced channels inside our mind and further reinforcing them, we're creating an alternative one. Oh, pain? Let's go to the body. And that alternative channel, the reason why it works is because that's when we're going to the body's natural ability to heal. Most of the illnesses that we face, the body has the has the capacity to heal itself. Most of the cuts that you get, you don't need to do anything about it. In fact, you shouldn't do anything about small cuts. Play with it, look at it, touch it. Just let nature take its course. It will fix it by itself. Same with digestion. You don't need to think about digestion. The body has its own internal wisdom, its own internal healer. And this is exactly what happens when you go and you divert attention from, oh, what am I going to do about it? What's happening? It's so terrible. I hope I won't feel this way. I hope I feel better soon. And why am I feeling this way? What's the cause? Sometimes it's important to do it and to analyze and to write about it as opposed to ruminate about it, or to talk to someone about it as opposed to ruminating about it. But the most effective in most situations is to just go to the bodily sensation and be aware of it. Accept it. Don't try and fix it. Just let it be there and just observe it. And our internal healer will take care of itself. The key, in order to become adept at it, is to practice. It's to practice it, to do it over and over again. Just like everything else that we've discussed in this class. There are no quick fixes. How do we practice it? First, and this is part of their 8-week program, which I'm doing right now. The first is body scan. Become aware of your body just by lying down and thinking and observing, first of all, your foot, then becoming aware of your knee, becoming aware of sensations in your quads, becoming aware of sensations in your stomach, wherever it is, going through the whole body, and practicing and becoming more aware. And this is doing it in a cold state. This is doing it in practice, in a simulator. And then when we're in a hot state, when we actually experience that emotion, that painful emotion, we're ready to go to it, and we know what to do. Practice also means when we lose focus, we go back to it. And that's the practice. The practice is not remaining completely centered for 30 minutes. The practice is losing and coming back, losing focus and coming back again. And then also practicing in real life. So whenever I feel stressed, immediately going, okay, so what's the physical manifestation of it? Now here we're talking about the emotions, we're talking about the body. You can also practice by using cognitive reconstruction. How? For instance, let's say I'm thinking about a talk that I have to give tonight. And I'm very nervous for it. Large audience, important audience. And every time I think of it, my initial inclination is stress. And I get the adrenaline feel here, and I don't feel good about it. Or the knot in my stomach. So how do I deal with it? Each time I think about it, I say, okay, where am I feeling it in the body? Another way of dealing with it is cognitively reconstructing it and saying, instead of stress, what a privilege. Remember I told you I had a very large client that I had to speak to and was very stressed about that talk. And every time my mind went to stress, within half a second, I said, no, it's a privilege. It's so wonderful that I have the opportunity to do it. Again, this is different from avoiding. This is different from repressing. There is a time to simply accept and to give ourselves the permission to be human. However, it's useless to just constantly ruminate about it and simply strengthen the neural pathways. So this reaction of either going to the physical body or sometimes going to the cognitive reconstruction can be very useful. Remember, when we want change, we want to draw as much as possible on A, B, and C, on affect, on behavior, and cognition. And these are just two very helpful techniques. Again, I use it constantly, whether it's going to the body or going and cognitively reconstructing. Extremely helpful. And again, the data shows how helpful it is. Let's try it. Let's do a quick mindfulness meditation and incorporating some of the ideas that I discussed now and things that we've discussed in the past. So sit comfortably in your seats as much as possible, your back straight, leaning on the back if that is more comfortable. Elongate your neck as much as possible. Create a straight line in your upper body. Plant your feet as comfortably as you can on the floor. If they're crossed and you feel comfortable, uncross them. And rest your hands either on your legs or folded, however you feel comfortable. And if you feel comfortable, close your eyes. Wherever your attention is now, wherever your focus is now, bring it to your breath. Breathe deeply into your belly, and then breathe slowly, gently, gracefully out. Take a deep breath in, and slow, gentle, quiet exhalation. And repeat this a few times. If your mind wanders, simply, gently bring it back to the breath and practice. As you continue to breathe, shift your attention, your focus to your body. Your feet, shins, your legs, your waist, your belly, your back. Just scan your whole body, your chest, neck, your head, and find one area in your body that is slightly tense, that you feel more than others, that is less relaxed than the rest of the body. And whatever that part of the body is, shift your attention there and observe the discomfort, observe the tension, just observe and accept. It is. Continue to breathe deeply as you're observing that part of the body. And just look how interesting it is that you have that sensation there. With each breath, embrace it. There's nothing right, there is nothing wrong with how you feel. The feeling simply is. And continue with the breath to breathe into that part and then out of that part. Simply observing it, accepting it, being with it. Continue to be with that part of your body, with your breath, and experience the experience. Whatever it is, it is. And then gently say goodbye to the focus on that particular part, very gently, because you just embraced it, and return to your breath. And with your breath, wash, cleanse your entire body, starting with your soles, going all the way up to the top of your head. And each breath introduces a deeper calm, deeper acceptance, deeper being. Just experience, just feel the lightness, the light that comes from acceptance, from our natural state of being. Take another deep breath in, slow, gentle, quiet exhalation. And with the next exhalation, open your eyes. the person next to you is asleep, again, just gently nudge them or embrace them. The effects of mindfulness meditation, mindfulness therapy, is quite literally mind-boggling. What we're doing and what mindful therapy does is change our focus from doing to being. How is that? You see, usually when we experience something stressful, or when our mind goes to a sad place, our immediate reaction is, how can I fix it? How can I fix it? And we try to fix it by thinking about alternatives, or by getting ourselves to feel better, by thinking through the problem that we're facing. Why? Because this fixing mind works. I mean, it's because of the fixing mind that we have science and technology and progress, and it's because of the fixing mind, the thinking mind, that you got in here. You didn't get in here because you were a great meditator. You got in here because you did well on your tests. You were able to solve problems well on the SATs. And that's a good thing, and that's important skill, but very often it's counterproductive when it comes to dealing with mental, psychological issues. We gravitate toward it, we want to fix it, but very often it's counterproductive. Just like it would be counterproductive to try and meddle with the digestion that our body goes through, the digestive process. It happens independent of us. If we try and play with it, open it, look at it, help it, we'll only hurt it. Why? Because the internal mind, the internal healer, the internal wisdom knows best to deal with certain things. Not everything, but certain things, such as digestion, such as very often, not always, but very often, with mental afflictions, with painful emotions. So we're shifting our focus from trying to fix to simply be with that emotion, with that experience, with the manifestation of the pain. In their book, William, who teaches at Oxford, trying to get rid of depression in the usual problem-solving way, trying to fix what's wrong with us, just digs us in deeper. Rumination is part of the problem, not part of the solution. Now, the emphasis here is on rumination. It's not, and we've talked about it a lot, it's not the fact that if you're writing your journal, it's not helpful. It's good for you to write about issues that you're dealing with in your journal. It's good to talk to a very close friend. But just rumination and going over the same scenario over and over again, ruminating about it, trying to fix it, very often makes it worse. And would be better off just going to the emotion, going to the physical manifestation. Try it. See what's right for you. It may be right for you to, write for half an hour on one occasion and then just meditate on it for 10 minutes. Or it may be right for you to only write about it. It's different for different people, but what I'm doing here is I'm adding another tool to your psychological toolbox. And just like we can cognitively reconstruct, as opposed to seeing it as a threat, to see it as a challenge, as opposed to seeing it as a threat, to see it as a privilege, as opposed to seeing it as a failure or to see it as a learning opportunity, we can also have emotional reconstruction, where instead of just thinking and ruminating about it, we go to the experience. With a shift from trying to ignore or eliminate physical discomfort to paying attention with friendly curiosity, we can transform, quite literally transform, our experience. I'm going to leave you today with a last tip, and this is something that is very important and that I highly recommend doing for all of you, no exception. What I highly recommend doing is breathing. It's very, very, very important to breathe. And in fact, it's the one thing that's common to all the mindfulness meditation practices, and something that you can introduce into your life. Of course, I mean proper breathing. Something you can introduce into your life even if you don't meditate for 15 minutes or 45 minutes a day. What I'm talking about here is deep breathing, because here is what happens. In our modern world, we're mostly stressed and anxious. As a result of this, our breathing becomes shallow. And as a result of shallow breathing, when our breathing is shallow, we become even more stressed and anxious. And we go into this vicious cycle, vicious downward spiral of the fight or flight response. And that's how we go through most of our days. Fortunately, we can reverse this. And we can reverse this very quickly, because what we also know is that calm and well-being leads to deep breathing, and deep breathing in turn leads to calm and well-being. We can reverse the fight or flight response and enter what Herbert Benson calls the relaxation response within as little as 3 deep breaths. We can introduce these 3 deep breaths strategically throughout the day, just before class starts, just when a class ends, just when I wake up in the morning, or the last thing before I go to bed. 3 deep breaths, strategic points through the day, can transform a life. Andrew Weil, graduate of our medical school, now the University of Arizona, in his wonderful CD talks about breathing. If I had to limit my advice on healthier living to just one tip, it would be simply to learn how to breathe correctly. And that means breathing like a baby breathes, into the stomach. I told you I'm not going to teach you much new in this course. You know how to breathe. You learned how to breathe when you were born. All we're doing now is chipping away the excess stone so that you go back to your natural wisdom, your natural healer. In a wonderful book, Ali Crumb's dad, she did the article with Ellen Langer, Thomas Crumb, gives some good advice about how we can reverse the flight or fight response. And one of the things that the advices that he says is that each time you get to a red light, use it as an opportunity to breathe deeply, whether when you're walking and you get to a red light or in the car. Now, in the past, I introduced it. In the past, every time I got to a red light, it was annoying, especially if the light had just changed from green. Now, whenever I get to a red light, it's an opportunity, and I breathe deeply. Introduce deep breathing into your life just a few times a day, and that can have far-reaching consequences. So, I'll see you next week, and until then, breathe.